macho man whose only emotional states were anger and steak. I swear to you, I tried to make this video shorter. I went through an editing process twice. Both times, I wound up making it longer because I found out that I had more yet to say on what I was trying to say. So, prepare your attention spans and bear with me, please. Hello again, I am Blunty, and I want to talk about masculinity. This isn't a lecture or demand. It's barely structured enough to be fairly called an essay. It is just me hoping to make you, whatever you feel about what manliness is, go, huh, and maybe have a chuckle along the way too. So if you're here to be reactionary to what you think this video will be about, given whatever preconception you may have about my political leanings, please give me a chance. I've asked twice now. Before we begin proper, I've got the latest patch notes for the human software. No one reads patch notes, but this one feels kind of important, so let me read them to you here. Please be aware there's been a security bug found in humanity.exe. To address this, men will be patched out. In the forthcoming update, the man class, which was OP and attempts to nerf it, caused too much player backlash and competitive imbalances. The man player class for the Earth MMO has been irrelevant in the meta for a while now anyway, so from now on only women and non-binary player classes will remain. So from 3 down to 2. I heard someone else use this structure in a video recently, and I stole it because it's a really clever way to frame what some men think that modern society is trying to do to masculinity, what it means to be a real man, and how political correctness or woke culture and social justice warriors are trying to do to dismantle, diminish, dilute, destroy traditional masculine ideals about what it is to be a man and what it is to be manly. These men, with their simultaneously very brittle and very tight kung fu action death grip on the importance of what they think masculinity is or should be, they're of course a bit worried about all of this. There's many manly men out there who feel all kinds of threatened by the fact that masculinity has been insidiously changed and altered and fiddled with over the last 20 years or so in particular. And it's hard to deny them that. Masculinity has changed. They fear men are being subjugated or prepared for replacement or suppression. They feel their internalized sense of masculinity is being invalidated and worse, openly mocked. And that's a shitty way to feel. It's a shitty way to make other people feel. I'm sure we can all agree on that. These are valid feelings, but because of how these men think men are supposed to deal with feelings, their response tends to be outwardly faced aggression instead of introspective. So it's hard to get through to them about what's actually happening. Once a man is in threat mode, it's hard to penetrate the defenses because, you know, a real man doesn't like to be penetrated. Didn't really realize what I wrote when I wrote that until I read it. But really, the truth of it, masculinity isn't under attack. It's not being weakened or denied. It's being expanded, made larger, more powerful, and more useful. But to some men, it really doesn't look like that or feel that way. They're being told loudly that the way they feel as men about what it means to be a man, to them, is the wrong way to feel about being a man. Imagine if women had been treated like that, if a bunch of people constantly yelled at them about how they're being a woman wrong and a woman should be doing this instead. Why, they'd be miffed, to put it lightly, perhaps even hysterical, as women so often are, vulnerable as they are to emotional outbursts and uncontrollable fits of womanly hysteria. Men can get angry that some other man doesn't conform to what a real man should be, and that's perfectly natural. Men have to be unified because only in unity are we strong, which is really telling because the anger reaction is a product of fear, and to them being a real man means you're not a sissy boy who allows fear to dictate your actions because being a real man doesn't mean succumbing to fear. Anger instead. So there's a contradiction feedback loop where cognitive dissonance slips in and it smashes against the wall of self-awareness that they're so close to penetrating, and just generates more belligerence and more aggression in reaction to this, because the guard is up. Of course it is. They're being attacked. Now, let's turn this inward. I'm sure certain men who, given the tone and opening here, are already judging my masculinity. Perhaps even already having typed the words beta, or cuck, or soy boy, which are their favorite go-to shorthand words for suggesting that another man is lesser, diminished, feminized, not fulfilling what they think a real man, an alpha king lord of a man, a skin-shaped sack of testosterone and beard hair really should be. Manly. They think they know what I'm about to say because they think they've heard it all before from the low-T beta males who often talk about this stuff on the YouTubes. Who are submissive betas, frightened of the true alpha's manhood, and thus seek to sneakily dismantle it because they're not alpha enough to take it on head-to-head like a real man should. And if that's you, I'm sorry you're not man enough to listen to this whole video, that your manliness is so fragile it can't stand some examination. Is that how fragile your manhood is? Can't look at it in case it breaks? Go back to the gym. Eat your whey protein shake, which contains soy. By the way, I don't know if you've ever read the labels on those things, but also soy doesn't lower your testosterone levels as many of you think it does. I'll link to a meta study combining 41 separate independent studies of soy consumption in male humans and its effects specifically on reproductive health and testosterone levels. In the down below area, it's linked there if you want to look at it. I dare you to be manly enough to read even just the initial abstract, because the whole soy boy thing is meaningless. Anyway, I've made the challenge to your masculinity. No real man can now stop watching this video under threat of not being considered a real man anymore. Catch 22, gotcha, pa-pow. Sneaky. So saith the Council of Men. If you don't watch all this video, you're not a real man. My masculinity, my relationship to my masculinity has, as one's sense of self should do for anyone with enough brain cells to engage in a bit of self-reflection once in a while, has evolved significantly, in fact, over time. Gender gender is a construct. And I know that phrasing will trigger some people who think that chromosomes and gender are exactly the same thing and are immutable and linked, but come on, man. Come on, dude, bloke, mate. Stop. You know that's not how it works. You're not a fool. Stop being disingenuous about it, because the ramifications of that fact shake your own constructed identity as a man. Gender is a social construct. It is. What a man is, what a man does, what a man is expected to do, expected to take responsibility for in the workplace, in the family, in society, down the pub, how a man behaves in the protection of others, or how he should react emotionally to volatile situations, is very, very much a societal thing. It's a sociological construct, if you will. This is obvious because different societies, different cultures, even different subcultures can all have quite different expectations from men. The expectations of a man's behavior in Australia is quite different from what a man in, say, India is expected to be like. There are some common threads, no doubt, but also some massive differences. Within Indian society, for example, there are certain behaviors from men which are expected, others which are condoned, others which are just kind of tolerated because this is men, whereas these same actions, these same behaviors in my culture would absolutely not be tolerated. It has nothing to do with genetics or general biology, not even with how much red meat is eaten, or indeed soy. It's just a societal difference. Their culture is different from my culture. This is what we mean when we say gender is a social construct. We're not saying it's utterly imaginary and can be ignored. We just mean it's money, like this coin. This coin is made with about 8 cents worth of metal, but we have constructed a system in which we all agree to pretend that in this form, this metal token, in this society, in Australia, this is worth $2 in exchange for value compared to goods and services. Money is a social construct too. It doesn't mean it's not real or without value or purpose. I can use this money to get things done. Not much because it's only $2, but you get my point. Gender is real in the same way, but it's also undeniably a societal construct, and it's not the same thing as simple biological facts. Anyone who says different about gender is either knowingly lying or is ignorant on a scale that can only be willfully deliberate. They don't want to know the truth. That's a bit cowardly. As a social construct, gender can even change over time if your society needs it to. And I'm not talking about individual genders. I'm talking about what gender means within the society. What being a man means to you now, at the end of 2021, is really not what being a man meant to someone, living in 1928 or even 1990, a year I lived through. A year as a 12-year-old feeling the first surges of puberty, started to learn what being a man meant in broader society as opposed to being a boy. And what should I do with my freshly testosterone-fueled aggressive urges? Well, society taught me that. In the binary definition of gender in pretty much all cultures and communities, men are expected to behave one way and women are expected to behave another. And different cultures have different expectations about what a man and what a woman can and should be and how that interaction should work. And we are taught these things from family, from friends, from our culture, from books, from TVs, from movies, from comics, from music videos. Our gender expression, in very large part, is learned behavior, influenced hormonally. Sure, boys tend to be more aggressive, for example, because testosterone tends to do that, and we have more of it than girls tend to. But all this starts well before puberty, well before any secondary sexual characteristics emerge. As we grow up from infants and start developing our own identities past a screaming, pooping, milk-fueled wad of squishy flesh. Why did I describe a baby like that? I've been fiddling on this script for quite some time. I don't remember when or what mood I was in when I wrote that description of what being a baby is. But congratulations, past Monty, you cracked yourself up. We start developing our identities past a screaming, pooping, milk-fueled wad of squishy flesh. And we are actively taught what the gender differences mean and how we should act in relation to that, both actively from our caregivers and passively by observation of other people around us and things like media. We learn to perform our gender roles so deeply and ingrained and internalized that a lot of us don't even think about it that way. So when someone says gender is performative, you go, no, it's not, it's just how I am. I'm a bloke, act like a bloke. Unless, of course, what you feel and what you're taught don't align in the way society considers normal, then you're really going to notice it and have a chat to a non-binary person or a trans person about that feeling, because you'll learn something. It's in our acts and our deeds, not our gonads, that our presentation of how masculine we are is seen and judged. This is where the term we get, gender presentation, leaking in from the sides. This is what it's all about. Some of that is just kind of automatic, depending on what we learned and internalized growing up. In my family, for example, men did the barbecuing in summer, and the women, they did the salads. Fucking Catholic boomers, man. And a real man had a proper opinion on if propane gas or wood made for a better fire for irretrievably burning cheap steaks on. These things are cliches that you see in sitcoms for a reason. We laugh at it because we know it's inherently silly, but we also know it happens around us in all our families. Some other stuff is a very deliberate performative choice, though, not just sort of internalized and semi-automatic. Do you think the fact that it was considered gentlemanly to hold the door for a woman is some kind of chromosomally controlled instinct. This is what men do. They hold doors. It's in our genes. It's in our chromosomes. Perhaps it biologically evolved as we invented doors in response to how a woman's statistically smaller hands made doors more difficult for them to operate. So we evolved the instinct to open and hold doors for them. Is that what you think happened? In this example, of course, doors, like all things, were invented by men for men to use with man-sized hands on man-sized knobs. I wrote that bit at about 4 a.m. this morning. Didn't reread it before this part. Cracked myself up again. Doorknobs as metaphor for the other kind of knob you see. Wordplay. Or is a man holding a door open for a woman a deliberate performative action designed to subconsciously reinforce to both parties that men are chivalrous leaders and that women should and indeed need to learn to rely on us? It's the second one, of course. It's a facetious question. It's entirely performative. It's a gendered etiquette expectation within our society. We're taught that men should do this. My nan taught me about this when I was really little. I can remember very clearly that she insisted that I, the little gentleman, need to hold the door for my mother and sister. This example is a reasonably benign one. I hold doors for people, not just women, but even other men, because it's a timely piece of kindness you can offer someone else, and it costs you nothing but like 8 seconds of time extra to hold the door. I even hold doors for other men who are larger and stronger, and therefore, by the rules of men, more dominant than me. That's how secure I am in my masculinity. But I should never, ever, under those circumstances, snarkily spit the words out the side of my mouth, ladies first, with a deep bow and derision and mockery in my voice, at the expense of the other man's own masculinity, because mocking another man's masculinity is, well, it would give the intent that I want to challenge him to mortal combat for door honor, which I don't usually do. But there's other rather less benign examples of performative masculinity too. I have, as most men do in this day and age, and particularly those men around my age, an especially complicated relationship with my own masculinity and how I have learned to express it and how I want to express it. Physically, I present as masculine. I'm broadly built, densely muscled, broad-faced, beard, of course, large hands, all that kind of thing, all typical maleness signifiers as far as the stereotypes go. These physical traits, largely biological and in general considered to be the way a man should be. My performative masculinity, however, is perhaps a bit more deliberate than other men's performative masculinity is because I'm autistic. So a lot of my behavior in public or in shared spaces is performative. Not just the stuff that men are taught we need to be, to do and say, but the kinds of stuff other people just take for granted. Many autistic people do what we call masking. We perform in ways sometimes unnatural to us because that's what's expected in that social interaction. It puts other people more at ease when you're not doing or saying unexpected things, as some autistics can tend to do. If things go to plan, the accepted societal script, if you will, people are comfortable and they treat you better. If I went with my natural urges as an autistic guy, I can make things very, very awkward and weird very, very easily. And in return, they get uncomfortable, and in return, I might get treated more poorly as a result. So it's what we got to do, sadly. We kind of have to learn how to respect the social constructs around acceptable, polite human interactions, and we perform them more deliberately than normal people tend to. I wish I didn't feel the need to mask as often as I do, but for the benefit and comfort of others, it makes some things just, well, not easier, not for me certainly, but at least smoother. The same is true of my performative masculinity. And I've consciously changed what kinds of masculinity I use, which man mask I wear over the years as I gathered more experience and more insight into how it affected other people. It's a useful skill to know, for example, how and when to make yourself seem as severe and immediate physical threat as possible to keep yourself and others safe from violence. I did this the other day, in fact, in a supermarket. Some a-hole was picking on a kid with a stutter, mocking him and imitating his stutter. And I used performative masculinity in a protective role to intimidate this dick. Now, I'm usually pretty good at a threat display, a masculine threat display, being imposing enough without starting or provoking actual physical violence in situations like that. It's a careful balance. So performative hypermasculinity, if you like, used correctly, can help de-escalate dangerous situations. It's a useful thing. Or, when not used smartly, it can make them much, much worse by escalating into actual physical violence and making everything way worse for everybody in the area. This time, it worked. The bully, faced with someone larger and more threatening than them, decided not to roll the dice on whether or not they could take me in a fight, and they backed down and retreated. Most bullies are cowards anyway, so hardly a shock. It usually works for me because I look traditionally masculine enough to carry it off. A useful application of performative masculinity is a man's job, after all, to be a protector, isn't it? Is there a responsibility for being so big and tough? It's just as useful to know how to relax the masculinity to make other people feel as safe as possible in what otherwise would be a situation where you might make someone more vulnerable or more anticipatory of male aggression, anxious, or even flat out afraid. It's not unreasonable for them to react that way, given that men can and will use their strength, their size, their aggression to assert dominance, as we have been trained to do by the social construct of what real men do, as I just did in that last story about the dude in the supermarket. So, to be aware that the very fact of your masculinity can, unfortunately, be seen as a very real, ever-present possibility of threat, of personal danger to some people is also important. You don't get to ignore that. You don't get to use your masculinity and ignore how it makes other people feel. So I'll do things like allow more than a common amount of personal space in enclosed spaces. I'll very carefully never position myself between the door and someone who doesn't know me well enough to know that I'm not a threat. I'll sit or lean to make myself physically smaller and less overbearing. You know, little body language tricks like that can help. Or say I'm walking behind a woman on a quiet street at night. Maybe it's even poorly lit. I'll drop my distance way back or change sides of the street, just to make sure I don't come across as a threat and make that person's evening worse. So I've not only internalized what it is to be a man, but I've internalized an anxiety about making other people feel unsafe based on what the social construct of a man is, and the perception of a man and the threat he intrinsically presents to be. Think about that. Performative masculinity is tricky, but very useful when used correctly and intelligently, but also being aware of and sensitive to how your masculinity is perceived is the most important thing, I think. Especially now, as attitudes and expectations have started to shift as newer, younger generations who grew up slightly more free of the more toxic influences of masculinity than we Gen Xers did, start to dictate how they want their society to be and how they want their men to be. I mean, how they would want their society to be in theory if the earth wasn't going to boil us all to death first. Sorry about that, kids. I blame the boomers still. We still have a very long road to get clear of some of the rot, the old rot in the roots of performative masculinity. It's still there, very present. That's why we're talking about it today. In my youth, my violence-filled youth, in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of what we now refer to as toxic masculinity going around. The pressure on a guy to conform to some idealized typical of what a real man should be and act like and to present to the world. It was immense, and it saturated the media we watched. Absolutely saturated it. There was some stuff that I was taught a real man should do that are in fact genuinely good things to be. It wasn't all bad. stand up for the underdog or the victimized. Well, so long as the victimized you're standing up for is the right kind of victim, we'll roll across that in a minute. But there was the other rather more emotionally and psychologically damaging stuff that we're also taught to internalize. Step outside the tropes of what a real man is, and you risked immediate and severe peer reactions, bullying, mockery, rejection from the social group, even brutal physical violence was a very real risk if you didn't conform to manliness. And I'm not even talking about the homophobic side of things here, but oh, you bet, woe betide those boys who might have come across as gay or admitted to their peer group that they play with their sister's Barbies or something. Hell, one kid in my high school 9th grade science class got called homophobic slurs for a whole term just because he lit a match to ignite a Bunsen burner in science class by striking it away from him, not towards him, like a real man does. Because a real man strikes the match towards him because he's not afraid of fire or something. I'm not making this up. It's a real thing. A real man lights a match in a special way. A real man checks his nails in a special way and not the other way, because that says something about how much of a real man he is. In this context, real man is code for straight, obviously. Now, I'm talking about the broader shit that messed up basically my entire generation. Real men, for example, do not cry. Men do not sob and wail like a woman. You suppress your weak emotional outbursts. You hide your weakness when you face adversity and challenge. You must do so with a stoic, stone-faced indifference, with a scowl, not a tear. And if that doesn't work, you are permitted perhaps one single tear to reluctantly roll down your face of stone, and you must turn that away from any other man that is close enough to witness it, lest you be considered vulnerable and weak, which is not what a real man is. Then you may, screaming in fury at your inability to withhold your emotional weakness, then get to release your rage and hit things until your feelings go away. Failing finding something to hit, you may drive very fast while trying to crush the steering wheel's internal steel band into a fine, misty powder. Failing that, you may drink yourself into a numbed stupor, but do so alone, lest the lowered inhibitions the booze creates makes you vulnerable all over again to crying, "You great big Jesse." Now, you probably think I'm being facetious or exaggerating, but I'm going to link you to a video in the down below again, all about men crying in TV and movies. It will blow your damn mind how absolutely insidious it all is and how relentlessly, endlessly reinforced it is that men don't fucking cry. You get crying properly, uncontrollably sobbing as a young man back in the 90s, and you were never ever allowed to forget your own pathetic, womanly weakness. The reason? Didn't matter. There's plenty more, of course, but I'm sure most of you get it or know by now firsthand. Statistically, most of my audience is men, and if you're a young'un, too young to remember the 90s, ask a family member or a friend closer to my age what the 90s was like emotionally as a boy becoming a man. Watch their eyes. Watch for the flicker of vague trauma to flash across their face. We were inundated with role models of hyper-aggressive, hyper-masculine, grim-faced macho men whose only emotional states were anger and steak. Come the second half of the 90s, things had started to slide a little bit, and there was a thing called the metrosexual. A nice thing in that it gave some men a bit more permission to access their more feminine side, or at least tone down the hyper-masculinity performance mode a little bit. A metrosexual could care about their clothes and skincare, and some even tried makeup, although they had to call it guy-liner, not eyeliner, because guy-liner is different from girly eyeliner. The guy-liner is a guy thing that guys do, not a girl thing that girls do. And with body spray, not boy perfume. And any effort to control any tidiness of body hair was called manscaping. because it's a manly thing like landscaping except with hair. I still hear that term manscaping being thrown about by marketing, exclusively by marketing. I've never heard a real person use it in years, but usually trying to sell boys and blokes ways to shave their balls and whatnot. What the metrosexual fad actually boiled down to, however, more often than not in my experience, was straight men adopting some of the stereotypes of gay men, like the extra attention to haircuts, personal grooming, flashy fashion choices, and not smelling like a moist forest freshly coated in engine grease. A few women my age viewing this video just had a very intense sensory memory, didn't you? You know the exact smell I'm talking about. And it was often with the end goal to manipulate women into thinking they were more sensitive and safer than a normal guy, so they could hook up with them. And I know this for a fact because I asked some of my metrosexual mates and acquaintances about it, and they would gleefully, excitedly admit it was a pantomime so they could trick a girl into bedroom-based playtime, and exactly how well it worked at tricking girls. These metrosexuals, or sensitive new age guys, which were also called snags for short, were largely mocked by real men, by blokes unsettled by their own masculinity and trapped in performative shit that never really felt right, but still felt like it needed to be defended as traditional masculinity because otherwise you might feel pretty silly about it all and self-conscious about the batshit stupid crap you've internalized about what being a man is. And introspection is not what a man does. A man does not philosophize with a flute of white wine held aloft in a limped wrist. A man acts, goddammit. I was, for the record, one of the latter people. I mocked the snags. I had my mates who were a bit snaggy. I bullied them, essentially. I felt a bit shit about it at the time, and I knew it was petty and stupid and arbitrary, but I also knew that what they were doing didn't feel right. It wasn't how I was taught to be a man. I fell back on the more familiar masculinity I'd been indoctrinated with since I got my first action figures. Action figures which were not at all homoerotic pantomimes of idealized manhood and masculinity, but an achievable life goal, a man goal, if you will. They were manspirational. Like that one? Time went on, I grew, as we hopefully all do. I learned some hard lessons about how my behaviors can affect other people in ways I wasn't prepared to deal with emotionally, and I started making changes. Eventually, slowly, I unlearned as much of the automatic toxic manly man crap as I could, and I worked harder at understanding what my performative masculinity choices were saying about me to other people, and how it made them feel. These days, I'm at what I've come to call my gentle masculinity. Internally, I feel pretty masculine in gender. I'm not afraid to express what we traditionally call femininity, but I'm not gender confused or anything. I'm not questioning, but I don't feel feminine either. So I express, present, and feel masculine, and that's how I'm comfortable. But it's a long way from what I was taught masculinity had to be all about to be considered valid by other men. I will even tell people when a movie made me cry, for example, without even thinking about it, without feeling embarrassed about it. Not too long ago, when talking about this attitude shift to one of my friends, they called it soft daddy mode. Not sure how I feel about that term personally. I have other complicated feelings about the concept of dads or being looked upon as a dad, but sure, the term is a bit cute. It makes me giggle. Soft daddy mode. Fine. The point is, though, to never be perfect. No one's perfect. It's just simply to try and do better, or at least have the self-awareness to see when you've done a crap thing in a crappy way, especially a crappy thing in a crappy way based on culturally performative gender-based behaviors and expectations. And I usually try not to suppress my natural predilection for masculine aggression, for example. There is, after all, a real and undeniable biological, hormonal factor in that. And suppressing that is just as problematic as letting it flow unfiltered. Because as anyone has even heard the word psychology before, if you suppress all that aggression for fear of letting it out, it's going to do some pretty troubling things, eventually. So instead, I try to channel it in more useful ways, kinder ways, more supportive ways, soft daddy ways. My gentle masculinity, masculinity that in no way diminishes or prevents me from expressing and embracing a, let's call that a steel masculinity, but only when I need it, and only when it's useful and productive. Perhaps, in some ways, it's like a firearm. Some people like having one. I like the power it represents to protect or destroy, even if they really hope very much that they'll hardly ever need to actually point it at somebody. Pretty manly metaphor, right? Guns. So don't be a dude afraid to self-examine. That sounds cowardly, right? What are you afraid of discovering? It's not very manly to be cowardly and afraid of discovering something by self-examining. Man up! Men should be brave. We all should. Bravery and self-awareness are good things to reach for anybody of any gender expression. In any case, thank you very much for your massive attention span to get to the end of this. Hopefully you found it interesting, entertaining. You might have even got a chuckle from time to time. I crack myself up from time to time because 18 different versions of the script have gone through the ringer over the last, I think, about 9 months since I made the first notes on it. Hard to boil it all down. So thank you for getting through it. Hopefully listening, hopefully learning something. Hopefully finding a way to phrase things when you're trying to explain this to other people. You might have already felt some of these things, but didn't know how to present them to someone else who wasn't quite understanding what you were talking about. Maybe this was useful for that. I hope so. And thank you, as always, of course, to the patrons scrolling up above there, whose above and beyond support is beautiful. Thank you. It's a very manly thing to do, to support another man in that way. Or possibly a very womanly thing to do for those women who have also joined the Patreon, or the non-binaries. Basically, give me money, it makes you a better person? No, I think I've undercut myself. Fuck.